having me. And today, I'm here really to give you an overview of managing county finances, and the goal is to give you some insight on some tools that you can use to help in planning. And I want to take a show of hands first. Christine told me that there's a variety of folks here. How many of you are either council members or commissioners? How many? Okay. And then how many folks are other county officials, so auditors with different departments within? Okay. Is there anyone else I missed who wants to just raise their hand? Recorders. Well, yeah, I mean other county folks, obviously the recorders. Currently, many units of local government in the state are really facing a lot of fiscal challenges due to rising costs, declining revenues, lack of economic growth, and property tax losses due to the circuit breaker tax caps. And really, all of these factors are impacting the way that we budget. And there's really a greater need to identify potential budget deficits and cash flow shortages in order to be proactive and to develop, really a plan to manage to avoid these situations. Taking a short-term approach is really no longer feasible. Used to be that you would really put together your budget and it was really truly a one-year budget. And now you're really needing to look not only at what you have been spending historically, but also truly doing projections moving forward. So really looking at monthly and long-term financial projections are a necessary component of any major policy decisions, especially when you're looking at budget deficits. A monthly cash flow, so we look at cash flows really in a couple of different ways. You need to do a monthly cash flow to know and to see when the timing is of the receipts and disbursements that you receive, so that you can plan for potential cash shortages throughout the year. The timing of these receipts and disbursements is important when you construct these monthly cash flows because different revenues are received at different points in the year. So your property taxes, which I think is the largest revenue source that you have, you only receive that twice a year. So you get that in June and December. And then there are other distributions that you receive on a monthly basis, like your income taxes. And so, between January and June and then July and December, there may be times between those major influxes of cash where you may not have, where you may see that you're having shortages. And so putting together cash flows on a monthly basis can help you see where these shortfalls might be so that you can take steps in order to avoid any disaster. In conjunction with really then the monthly, more the kind of the annual look at your cash flow, you also need to be looking at your finances in a long-term approach. And long-term fiscal plans or comprehensive financial plans are cash flow projections that extend out 3 to 5 years. And you look at history of 2 to 3 years, and then you're using what you've learned with your history to then project forward. So they can be used to really develop a plan to either maintain service levels, and you can also use that in your planning of if you have declining resources. In addition, long-term fiscal plans may be used as a model then to analyze what happens if certain types of events occur. So if you introduce a new fee structure, introduce a new revenue, what might happen? And you can really use these long-term financial plans as a roadmap to the future. And you can project your financial impact for your plans and priorities over the next few years. The reason why we say to look at your projections really on a 3 to 5 year time frame is because really anything out further than that, it's stale information. Just think about with even the tax caps, how I mean, we've had the tax cap since 2008, 2009, fully implemented since 2010. I mean, think about 10 years ago how we were budgeting, and things are very, very different now. So, and even with recent changes with personal property tax and other types of things that are being considered, that will impact your revenues as well. One of the key elements to a long-term fiscal plan is the revenue forecasting. And really the best way to do that is to look at your historical receipts over the last 3 years, and those can be used as a basis for estimating your revenues. And then in addition, you want to look at anything that may be negatively impacting revenues, such as circuit breaker tax credits, or whichever funds you have that are rate-driven funds, so your cumulative funds. If you have a decrease in assessed valuation, then you would collect less revenue based on the rate that's capped for those rate-driven funds. So that would be something else that you need to consider. Other key elements then of including the forecasting and really for the cost of providing services, your debt management and capital planning types of plans. But really a long-term fiscal plan provides a baseline for future financial operations that can be used to analyze these what-if scenarios. So once you have kind of a baseline set up, you can look at what happens if you introduce different revenues, or what if they are taken away, or what if you make different changes operationally, how will that impact things within the 3 to 5 year time frame. Budgeting, and I know Courtney touched on some of this as she shared earlier today, but really, I know she was approaching that more from just the kind of the mechanical piece. But really, we look at budgets as really your foundation for financial planning. And really the question is of how much to budget. Really there's a difference between how much you can budget and how much you should be budgeting. And I'll get into that in the next several slides because you may get different answers to those questions. There are really two basic guidelines then to budgeting. We talk about matching your spending plan with your annual receipts and then maintaining a minimum reserves in your funds. So we talk about preparing a balanced budget. So that means that within a particular calendar year, the receipts that you bring in, that what you are planning to spend, your disbursements then don't exceed your receipts within a calendar year. And if you think about that, if you can apply that to your own personal financial situation, you know how much you make, how much total revenue that you have, and then you can plan plan how you want to spend your money around that. And if you spend more than you bring in, then if you have a savings account, then you can dip into your savings if that's what you choose to do. But then you'll get to a point where you've depleted all of your savings, and so then you truly will be tied to only what you bring in. So you'll be living paycheck to paycheck. And that's the same kind of, the same type of philosophy that you can look at on a larger level with the county's finances. In terms of the minimum amount of cash reserves that you want to have, we usually talk about like a 10 to 15% or a 15% operating balance, but really that number can be different depending on your individual circumstances. So some folks, the ideal, they say, is to have up to 50% operating balance, which is, I've seen it in some places, but it is not as common as it certainly once was. And so a common rule of thumb could be, 2 to 4 payrolls, or some sort of metric that you count as a county, then determine, what is working best. But barring some special type of discussion about what you want for that operating reserve, 15% is a good target for that. And if you're not at that minimum requirement of 15%, that's something that you could work toward. So you don't need to feel as though you need to get there in 1 year. That's something that you could phase in over a couple of years. When you're developing your budget, really there are 4 key questions that you should consider. The first is, are available revenue sources enough to fund operations and provide essential services? The second question is, how much can we afford? And that really is kind of the driving force of putting together any sort of budget plan, is looking at how much money you're bringing in. Then looking at certainly what your future plans are and what challenges may be coming, depending on what changes there may be with the revenues that you may be able to collect. And then finally, looking at a plan for eliminating or at least managing those deficits that you may be experiencing. Here I'm listing the 4 really basic steps for budget development. The first is kind of projecting out what your estimated ending cash balance will be. So looking at where you expect your financial position to be at the end of the year. Estimating your receipts for the budget year, and this will really help in determining the maximum amount that can be funded. Then you can look at estimating your disbursements and developing a spending plan that's then based on the cost to provide essential services, and then what else needs to be done to accomplish these priorities throughout the year. And finally, looking at a plan really then to developing a plan to then manage these deficits. Are there additional revenue streams that can be implemented? What types of cost-saving measures have you taken or will you plan to implement? Are there permanent budget reductions that may be necessary? And also looking at what your current cash balance or cash reserve policy is and whether or not that may need some revision. So I'm going to go through an example here. In this example, we're showing beginning cash of $200,000 and available money within that year of $700,000, bringing your total funds available to $900,000. So in the next several slides, we'll talk about how much really should you be budgeting. This first example is showing an unfunded budget. Again, showing that you have $900,000 available, but you have a budget plan of $950,000. So based on this proposed spending plan, your ending cash would be in the negative, and the DLGF would not approve a budget with a negative ending balance. They would cut this budget to $900,000. So they wouldn't allow you to budget for more than you could show that you could afford. And in this case, the recommended reserve would be almost $143,000. In this next example, we're showing a funded budget, but a budget that's still not balanced. And in this case, we still have the $900,000. You can budget up to $900,000, but then you would be left with zero cash at the end of the year. And that, is not good for a lot of reasons, but at the end of 2014 in December, you'll have payrolls that will be due in January, and so you obviously will need to have money in order to meet those requirements. And it's not showing, we don't have the minimum cash reserve being met in this case either. And unfortunately, that's really usually what we see is folks are budgeting really every dollar that they have, even though in their minds they're not planning to spend all of it. But I think taxing units in general have kind of gotten into the habit of, that line 11 on your 1782 notice that shows what the operating balance will be. That line 11 more often than not is zero. And I'm not sure how we got to that trend, but usually, that's normally what I see. Very rarely do I see an operating balance. Maybe it's because we think that the DLGF might take some of that money away or reduce our maximum levies, which they won't do, but I think that may have been the impetus for why we've gotten into that habit. So for this example of a balanced budget then, you have $900,000 available, but within the year you've only receipted in $700,000. So to truly have a balanced budget, you should only be budgeting and actually spending no more than $700,000. So then you'll end the year with, here in this example, we're showing $200,000 and you're exceeding your minimum reserves by double. So you have about about a 30% operating balance there. But let's look and see what happens if you do this year after year. Because certainly if you have enough money in a few years to not have a balanced budget, you can certainly dip into that. And I think that there are reasons why you may choose to do that. I tend to think, my personal opinion is that if there are projects or one-time types of expenditures that you want to make, then I think that's a reason that you could justify not having a balanced budget. But if your budget is not balanced because you need to use it to pay for recurring expenditures like personal, like your employees, benefits, insurance, those kinds of things, then you need to be looking at either, on the one hand, either increasing your revenues or looking at other places or ways that you can cut the amount that you're spending. So in this example, you can see in year one that the total funds available are $900,000. They're budgeting $800,000, ending the year with $100,000. So you're decreasing your total cash position by $100,000. In year two, you can again budget up to $800,000. You'll still have $15,000 at the end of the year. But then in year three, you can see that you are constrained now within that year. You're taking away your flexibility by not having a balanced budget, unless you're spending it for reasons that really aren't recurring. I alluded to this, but I wanted to go through some of the common myths that we get a lot of questions on during the budget process and when we put together plans like this. The first is that your budget appropriations need to be overstated in order to get your full maximum levy. And that's not true. Your maximum levy is separately approved and does not take into account how much you want to budget for. The maximum levy, I know Courtney went through this calculation. It's based on the statewide growth factor. And in theory, you could budget zero in even your general fund and still be approved for the maximum levy. I don't know if this has happened in any of your counties or really even any of the taxing units within your county. I'm sure it has, but if for some reason there's an advertising error, a lot of times DLGF will hold you to your previously adopted budget, or you'll just have zeros for all of your appropriated budgets. So then you'll have to go in and do additional appropriations for that. But if you'll recall, it didn't affect the amount of levy that you were eligible to collect. It just meant that you had to spend the extra time and expense to advertise for the additional appropriation and go through that process. The second I have here is that the DLGF will cut your budget if your operating balance exceeds 50%. There are a few exceptions to that, fire territories being one, but the DLGF doesn't have any authority to reduce your maximum levy. Although it is my understanding that if you apply for certain appeals, this would probably apply really more to cities and towns who may be annexing land, but it's my understanding that if you're showing cash reserves, that they may not, fully approve a levy adjustment there because you're showing that you have sufficient monies to continue with the operations. The third misconception is the DLGF will cut your budget because you underspent your budget. The DLGF will not cut your budget if you can show that you have money to spend. So a lot of times when you're putting together your budget for the ensuing year, so this summer and fall, when you're putting together your 2015 budget documents, you're putting together a budget that's an 18-month budget. And there's a lot of things that can happen from when you have to include your June 30th cash balances till when you receive your 1782 notice and your budget order. And so I know, at least for a lot of the folks that I work with, if they receive their 1782 notice after December 31st, so after they've closed out their year, and they receive their 1782 notice and there are cuts to their budget, or maybe their revenues aren't stated, they're different than what we thought they were going to be. At that point, you can put together a new cash flow to show them what your actual cash position is based upon actual spending through the end of the year, and you can get some of that budget restored. You just have to have a cash flow to show that. And I mean, there's no reason why they wouldn't approve it unless they don't agree with the numbers that you've provided, and you can talk through that with them. The fourth note we have here is that you can afford to spend 100% of your budget just because the DLGF certified it. And I will say that before circuit breaker came into play, that yeah, I mean, you could spend everything that you were certified for because there was certainty in the amount of money that you were going to get. But now, the way, and I'm sure you know this, we've had circuit breaker, we've had the tax caps for many years now. I think we've all learned, either the hard way or just probably through the hard way, is that DLGF is not taking into account any circuit breaker losses that you may be experiencing. They will, on the line item, I think it's a line 7, where you include your property taxes to be received through the end of the year. They will not adjust that for what you know, even when you know what your circuit breaker losses will be. They assume that you would collect 100% of that, which obviously is not happening in a lot of places. And so as a result of that, they may be approving a budget that is much higher than what you can actually spend. And so that kind of goes back to putting together a monthly projection, quarterly, putting together projections throughout the year so that you're monitoring what you're bringing in compared to what you were planning to spend or what you thought you were going to be able to spend, so that you can make those adjustments before, your December 15th, and you're like, oh my goodness, how are we going to meet our last payroll of the year? Which I think happens more often than, it just happens a lot, I think. And then finally, just the misconception that we don't have any control over our budgets, that the DLGF really decides how much you can spend and how much you get. And they're really following those statutory guidelines to put together what you can collect for your maximum levy. And really the budget is based on what you show that you can afford. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the tax caps and how those impact your revenue. This may be redundant, but I think it always bears repeating that, the tax caps limit total property tax bills. We have 3 classes of property. Residential homesteads are capped at 1% of their gross assessed value. Other residential, long-term care facilities, agricultural land is all capped at 2%, and other real and personal property is capped at 3%. And the tax caps limit the amount of money that can be collected, and it results in a direct loss to all of the taxing units that serve that particular taxpayer who is eligible for a credit. And circuit breaker credits then are allocated to each of the county or each of the units within the taxing district based upon the unit's rate in proportion to the total district rate. So, for example, a home that's valued at $100,000, the net assessed valuation is $32,750. So that includes the homestead deduction of, in this case, $45,000, the supplemental homestead deduction, and a mortgage deduction. And if you had just as an example, had a $4 tax rate, you would have a tax bill of $1,310. But your tax cap is 1%. So the maximum that you could pay is $1,000. And so this particular taxpayer would have a credit of $310. So they would only pay $1,000, and the $310 would be a loss for all of the units that serve that particular taxpayer. So, for example, if the county was 30% of that rate, the loss would be about $180 some dollars. But really, how do these credits then affect your budget? Because like I said, when the DLGF puts together or provides you with your 1782 notice, they are not taking the tax caps or the credits into account. And so in the example that we've been using of having $900,000 of total revenue, well, maybe of that, you have a circuit breaker loss of $100,000. So really, you only have $800,000 available in the first year, and then if you overspend, if you don't have a balanced budget, then you'll eventually have a negative balance there. But really this discussion is a good lead-in for then anticipating deficits and what you can do to then manage them. Funding shortfalls there are really two major reasons. And the factors can be either permanent or temporary. And the timing of revenue streams is really a common cause for a temporary cash flow shortage. You know, for example, you only receive property taxes 2 times a year, and that's your largest influx of cash. And so it's not surprising that between January and June, or between July and December, that you may dip down into, into a place where you're having a harder time meeting some of those obligations that you have. In addition, local income taxes, as those income taxes increase and decrease, that can impact a whole host of things. If you're a Cadgett County, it's going to impact the amount of property tax replacement that you have available to offset your levies. So that would result in higher levies that would be needed in order to, make the units whole. If you use either Cadgett or county option income tax as a true property tax replacement credit or as a homestead credit, then to the extent that you are bringing in less revenue, that would mean there would be less money available to provide as that credit. So then your effective tax rates, the tax rates that will be actually paid, will be higher, which can impact your circuit breaker tax credits as well. In addition, state distributed revenues have been declining over the past few years. And the last piece that I'm showing here as possible causes of funding shortfalls are erroneous assessed values, or if, when the budgets are put together, there's a certified assessed value, and as you all know, the certified assessed value may be close or it may not be close to what's actually put on the abstract when tax bills are collected. And so if you have a difference, if there's a major difference there between what's certified and what's being billed on, so if your abstract assessed valuation is higher than what's been certified, that's still going to be based upon the rates that were certified on that lower assessed value. So in theory, you might collect more in property taxes. They're billing more in property taxes, but you also could be generating more circuit breaker credits. So there could be an offset there. Or, for example, if your certified assessed value, this is the worst situation, if your certified assessed value is set and then your abstract is lower, if you're billing on less, then not only are you going to be impacted by the circuit breaker losses, but you're also going to be impacted because the rates that were certified were based on a higher assessed value, and you're billing even less than that. So you're already going to have a built-in shortfall there. In order really to effectively anticipate shortfalls, you need to look at the possible reasons that they may be affecting your taxing unit. Looking at trends that may be impacting your county, such as high rates of delinquency, and that could be a county-wide issue, or you might know that it's isolated to some of those incorporated areas in your counties. So knowing where and when, where those are concentrated. Any delays in property tax settlement, I think we're in pretty good shape there. And if you have a significant amount of circuit breaker losses, there are taxing units that are experiencing losses 20% and above. And as county units, I would say that I haven't seen that as often. And the reason for that is, the county, even though you are a piece of everybody's tax bill, you also are located in areas that have cities and towns, and then you're also located in a lot of areas that are unincorporated. And so that helps with your losses, because you may, if you looked at where your circuit breaker credits are coming from, if you looked at that from the abstract, you would see that you probably are receiving little to no credits in the majority of your unincorporated areas, and you may really only be generating credits in 1 or 2 taxing districts. At least I don't know about you, but really there's 1 or 2 taxing districts that are generating credits for everybody. And one piece I want to go through now is just understanding what the difference is between a cash flow shortage and then a structural budget deficit, because I think that it's important to recognize that you could be experiencing both. So a cash flow shortage means that you may have dips, you may go into the negative throughout the year, but at the end of the year, your budget was balanced. So you may have, in this example, so from April to June and July to September, the accounts dipped into the negative, but then by the end of the year, they were at the same cash position as they were in the beginning of the year. They had a balanced budget. And so in this case, this would be a cash flow shortage. So this is a timing issue. And so this is something that can be addressed by temporary borrowing. I have a list of ways you can manage these types of deficits. And then in this next example, very similar information, but you can see that in this example, at the end of the year, there's still deficits throughout the year in each of the quarters. And at the end of the year, you're looking at a negative ending balance. And that is a structural deficit. That is a permanent problem. That is a permanent amount that's a permanent amount that you're going to need to either shore up by increasing your revenues in some way, or by cutting, or, truthfully, in a lot of these cases, it's a combination of both. So you're just kind of cutting where you can, shifting money around, doing what you can in order to get to that balanced budget. So these temporary cash flow shortages are typically caused really then by the timing of receipts, and then the structural deficit really is when your annual disbursements are exceeding your annual receipts, and that's a permanent problem that needs to be addressed. So really this underscores the importance of preparing and maintaining cash flow and preparing projections. It helps you identify those cash flow shortages and then how to address them. It also helps you in knowing what money you may have available to invest, because if there is a minimum balance that you have maybe in all of your funds, like if you look at your cash flow throughout the year and you have a minimum balance, that's what they call your core balance. and that is the amount of money that you could feasibly put into the market, or put into, safe investments, but put out there so that you could get some additional interest earnings. I know that they are more minimal than they used to be, but there is still, if you have a core balance, there is still some money to be made in safe investments. Putting together these cash flows really also helps in putting together your contingency plans. It helps with just financial management, and it's also helpful for policy decisions. If folks are asking for more money to do certain types of things, you need to be able to explain why or why not you can afford to do some of those things. In a forecasted cash flow analysis, you want to separate your funds by the types of functions, so operations, debt service, capital projects. Again, looking at your history and projecting forward, and also thinking about whether or not the trends will continue, and taking into account what your circuit breaker losses will be. Certainly with the circuit breaker losses, these calculations are done on an annual basis, and they have to be done to be 100% accurate on a parcel level basis. And it's also true that depending on when the calculation is made, you may get a different answer, because if you're looking at different assessed values, then you may get a different set of answers. But I think if you know that in your county that if you have a good handle on what other folks are doing, what other taxing units are doing, that you could, if you know that, for example, your losses have historically been, 5%, for example, then you could, if you're putting together these cash flow projections and you can't put together the circuit breaker loss, you could use that as just a placeholder, just so you're putting it into your projections. At least don't leave it out, at least put something in there so that you know that will be revenue that's lost. And then once you've really determined that you have either a temporary cash flow issue or a budget deficit, what can you do? Well, for cash flow shortages, you can look at temporary borrowing. You can defer any non-essential type of spending like capital outlays, which are not a lot. You don't have a lot of capital outlays in a lot of your budgets anymore, but delaying that type of spending. And then you could also get tax anticipation warrants. The next couple slides talk about some of the other more detail of what you can do. Tax anticipation warrants are temporary loans that you receive, but you pay interest on them. So truthfully, to the extent that you can do temporary borrowing inside, within your funds, that is much cheaper than having to go out and get a tax anticipation warrant. And that's something that you can do. So if you have the cash to do it, I always recommend staying inside your funds first before you have to go out to get a tax anticipation warrant. And you can only borrow, I think it's up to, might be 80%, I think, of what your levy is. So they want to make sure they're taking into account any delinquencies or truthfully any circuit breaker credits or other things that would decrease the amount of money that you could borrow. Other options we have listed up here, temporarily using your cash reserves, paying costs out of other funds, more permanent ways to manage deficits, consolidating service deliveries, looking at modifying employee plans, types of contributions, fines, fees. Also looking at reallocating your maximum levy, which I think sometimes folks get into like a mode of, well, you put $100,000 or $300,000 in the health fund this year, so we'll just keep that same amount, into perpetuity. And that may or may not be feasible because maybe the health fund's costs have increased. So you may either need to pull from another fund or, those funds where the only source of revenue is property taxes. You may need to evaluate how you're allocating your revenue or your maximum levy into those funds. Another option, more of a long-term option, would be debt financing. And debt can be issued either as a general obligation bond or as a lease financing. And at least a lot of other types of taxing units, like schools in particular, are looking at issuing debt as a way to pay for deferred maintenance. So for monies, for projects that they aren't able to fund because of their cash flow problems, they're looking at issuing shorter term debt obligations. In a lot of cases for schools, they're making sure that they're not increasing their overall taxes because they tend to be more frequent issuers of debt anyway. And I know that counties and other types of taxing units may or may not have general obligation debt or debt that's payable from property taxes. And that's because you have other sources of revenue that are available to make debt payments. But certainly you could have debt that's paid from property taxes. Going back on the importance of cash reserves, I mean, they're important for a number of reasons, but they help you manage the short-term or the temporary cash shortfall problems. They provide a funding source for any sort of emergencies or unforeseen events. In terms of looking at if you are issuing any type of debt, if you are getting a bond rating, which would in theory give you a way to get lower interest rates, so you would pay less in the overall life of the bonds. This also demonstrates operational accountability and financial stability. And really, as I mentioned, the minimum reserve amount really depends on what your needs are. And in a lot of places, there isn't necessarily a formal policy that's written, but it's more of a consensus or just as a matter of course of action that there may be an informal policy and not something that's actually written out. Reasons for considering a minimum fund balance policy or what you should think about are things like your claim payments, frequency of the different types of taxes you receive, uncertainty of revenues or of expenses, and then what your future capital plans are, because you may be trying to save money in order to make in order to pay for a project out of cash on hand rather than issuing debt. Just some takeaway points for you. I mean, I think it's very important to put together a cash flow on monthly and long-term basis to help monitor your actual receipts against your actual disbursements. I think it's the most fiscally responsible thing that you can do, because then you can, with that knowledge, then you can plan. And I think that's really important because there's a lot of uncertainty. And so knowing where you are can help you in your planning. Preparing a balanced budget, so looking at what revenue you have available in a certain year and only spending as much as you're bringing in. That requires then adjusting that spending plan if you see that the amount of revenue that you're bringing in is significantly less or potentially more than you thought it was going to be. Understanding then the difference between what a cash flow shortage, so a temporary problem, and then that structural deficit problem, the more permanent issue is. And then really sorting through what those best options are for your community then for managing those deficits. With that, I'll take any questions you may have.